Good morning, everyone. It's great to be together. Thank you so much for being here. We're starting a year out of what I hope will be a series of years. My intent is to kind of do short snippets of Unitarian Universalist and Unitarian and Universalist and Proto Unitarian history over the years and break it out as we go. And in subsequent years, we'll start doing a deeper dive. And then all of this will be recorded and put on our website and hopefully be a resource for UU congregations worldwide. It's great that Community Church is sponsoring this kind of work together. And let's begin. We're going to start with what I would say we call Proto Unitarians and the early church, art and the Reformation for this first session of Roots to Leaves. I'll begin with probably, I would say, one of the more famous quotes of Jesus, and because we're starting at the beginning. Unitarian Universalism, however we understand it today, comes out of Christianity and Protestant movements, and then gets more complicated very quickly in recent years. Our first quote will be from Jesus himself, and it's about a mustard seed of faith. And I like this imagery. Our communications team, Starling and Dylan, came up with a Roots to Leaves metaphor for this program, this offering. And the mustard seed, I think about that. And the quote is, and I'll tell you why I think about it in a moment. Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say this to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be impossible for you." Now, in some ways, it feels like it's magical thinking, although there are so many sermons about this and why this line is important in the world of faith, in the world of Christianity. And I want to talk a little bit about it from a biological standpoint or a botanical standpoint. One of the things I think is amazing about mustard plants, humanity has come to it and nurtured and grown them to develop them over the centuries into every plant from cauliflower to broccolini. They were grown that way. And it's a good metaphor for how religion splinters into new iterations. It's human and biological and spiritual, but it all comes from one little seed of faith, a mustard seed. So I want to talk about the early church first. Often in mainstream media around Christianity, there's sort of a misnomer that Christianity is a right-wing experience, a far right-wing experience. I remember in my seminary days, we had about a quarter of the seminary were evangelicals, and easily half of them were religiously and socially, well, I should say they were socially progressive. And it's often a surprise to folks that evangelicals might be progressive. I have a bunch of friends myself who are evangelical Christians who have the same social values I do as in Unitarian Universalism. They're just theologically conservative Christians. And I want to go back to where that comes from. The early church, Jesus was a teacher, a prophet. Many folks would say a rabbi who's coming from the Jewish tradition. And there's no reason to think that he wasn't himself Jewish at the time. And the movement he birthed were known as the followers of the way. They weren't called Christians at that time, followers of the way. And it's, with all the messaging around Christianity that all the leaders were men. I mean, you have the disciples who are all men and Jesus is a man. The movement was funded by affluent women in the early days. The only reason that they could travel around was that women were supporting those teachings, funding it. And likewise, we often think of the apostles, the disciples as men, but the first apostle, the apostle to the apostles, was Mary Magdalene. And the later church goes through extreme efforts to disenfranchise her, to say things about her that weren't true, that she was a sex worker, not that being a sex worker is wrong or bad in any way, but that's what she was. And it was a way to kind of control her, even though she was the first witness in the Christian story to the risen Christ. And one more thing I'll say in the very early, I mean, we're going through 1,500 years in an hour. And next year, hopefully, we'll thin that out a bit more. But I want to get a sense of the core before we get to post-Reformation, where Unitarians and Universalists really come into life and control of a Christian narrative in the 1800s. So Jesus explicitly taught against hierarchies. He was a Jewish teacher and taught against living by the sword. He was a pacifist, exact quotes from him, turn the other cheek. And he was against getting involved in power plays with the government. Some of the famous lines were, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, render unto God what is God. And just that, without getting overly political, just that right there is direct counterpoint to a thread of Christianity in the current days. And I say all this before we go into Unitarian and Universalist heresies, that they're heresies by a dominant expression of Christianity. But that current dominant expression of Christianity within a part of Christianity is not indicative of the early church. So we're going to fast forward 200 years. It's about 260, the Common Era. Jesus died about 30 years into the Common Era. And we have our first non-Trinitarian. So I call this section Proto Unitarians. We did not exist, as we understand, even our earliest selves at this point. But there were early seeds in the first 500 years of Christianity that could have gone a different way that didn't. And his name is Sibelius. He was a non-Trinitarian. Much of what we know about him was written by polemics by his opponents. He would argue that God is three aspects, but not a trinity, much like the sun is warmth, light and circular form, warmth of the spirit, illumination of the sun, and form of the figure of the Father. He would be later labeled as against the mainstream, but at this point, there's not really a doctrine. That doesn't happen for another 100 years, 40, 55 years, 65 years, in the Council of Nicaea in 325. And this is where Christianity shifts from followers of the way of Jesus to a doctrine. Up until this point, Christianity doesn't have a set doctrine. So Constantine convened the bishops of the church in his empire. And imagine, like, it would be like former President George Bush calling all the bishops in the nation to set a uniform doctrine. You all have to come down to DC, and you can't leave the room until you set up that uniform doctrine. We would all be a suspect if that were to happen today. And that's the foundation of the Council of Nicaea and the birth of doctrine in the Christian church. What began with Jesus as anti-imperial, anti-hierarchical, 300 years later shifts into an imperial religion. And this council is fascinating because at the time, the mainstream movement on the ground was that practitioners' beliefs about Jesus were manifold. He was a teacher, he was a prophet, he was a rabbi, he was the Son of God, he was an angel. There was not a uniform view. There were different iterations about how Christianity viewed itself. And that got flipped on its head. The bishops went back and forth, and the dominant view became the minority opinion. And the bishops, not reflecting the grassroots on the ground, came up with a new religion or expression of religion. And with respect to my colleagues who are Christian that have a different view on this, I don't mean this in an insulting way. I just mean that we have a political moment in a intrinsically hierarchical and anti-imperial setup that becomes both. And the mainstream practitioners' beliefs get lifted up by Arius, and he is one of the bishops, and he's arguing very strongly for what becomes the minority opinion, even though the majority believes it. And the large part of the Nicene Creed, which comes out of the Council of Nicaea in 325, that is devoted to Christ, more than 80% of it, indicates that the main issue before the council was about Jesus Christ, not about the Father or about the Holy Spirit. They were all arguing about Jesus. What the main issue was more exactly can be seen by comparing the condemnations at the end of the decree, reflecting Arius's view, with the council's affirmations as contained in the body of the creed. So while Arius claims that Jesus was created, and this is really nuanced theological matters, and I'm not going to go into like seminary level on this, but I'm going to try to make it clear, because for a lot of folks, this stuff is complicated because it's mystical or mythical or academic, although it's still very deeply spiritual and theological for mainstream Christianity. Arius claimed that Jesus was created. The council concluded that he was begotten, that he was not made. That's in the language. And while Arius argued that Jesus was created out of nothing or out of something else, the council affirmed that he was begotten out of the substance or the essence of the Father. So they're of the same. And the statement in the creed that Jesus Christ is, and this is early language, homoousian with the Father, of the same substance, does not counter any of Arius's claims as reflected in the condemnation. The debate was not about what his substance is, but out of what substance he was generated. The term homoousios was added only because Emperor Constantine proposed and insisted on its inclusion. The main issues before the council was not the unity of the Godhead, but the Son's full divinity. And I want to, this also matters. I remember one time, I mean, of course this matters, but I remember one time when I was in seminary, I was both in the seminary choir and the gospel choir. And there was one choir piece around Christmas where they were doing a song about Saint Nicholas, the same Saint Nicholas that we get much of our Christian traditions, secular traditions around. And he was sainted because he was in opposition to Arius in the early church. And the song has a line where Nicholas punches Arius out. So when they were debating, they weren't just arguing verbally about all of this nature. And I remember saying at the seminary choir, and I'm Christian, I can't sing this song. It's directly talking about my early proto-denominational forefather parent, but it's alive today. And it's a crucial moment in the early church, going from followers of a way of Jesus to a doctrinal faith that's in line with the current imperial structure. And so I'm going to pause at this moment and ask folks, I'm going to have two reflection questions for you, and I'll put them in the chat. And if you're watching this later, think about it for yourself, or if you're in a congregation or a small group somewhere reflecting on this would be a great time to pause the video and think about these questions. And for folks who are here live right now, I will put it in the chat. Where do you see the early followers of the way, as Jesus's followers were called in their time, alive and well in contemporary UU? If this were but one part of our roots, where did the leaves sprout today? How did the process of doctrinal formation impact the tenor of Christianity? What do we do the same these days? And how is our polity, how we run our congregations, different? It's an interesting point around what the followers of the way were believing. Thank you for that question. In the early movement, the majority would have seen Jesus as a miracle worker, as a prophet, a teacher, probably a rabbi, that word was around then. People have different opinions about that, and that's not my area of specialty, so I won't definitively say that, because someone could say I'm wrong and they might be right. The early movement, though, didn't understand it necessarily as not a Jewish movement within Judaism. That shifts later. Within the lifetime of the apostles of Jesus, it shifts. Some of the apostles are clearly Jewish, and some apostles are moving away from Judaism. It's one of the early arguments around circumcision. And this is largely between Peter, who's Jewish, and Paul, who begins his career as adamantly anti what we would say is Christian, and then becomes adamantly anti what was Jewish. He was a Roman citizen. And there's a whole long answer to that. That is not, it's sort of beyond the realm of this. That said, if you look at what we call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're all telling the same story. Different language, not different language, different way of framing it, but they're all more or less, you can align them. And they're all saying the same thing in slightly different ways with slightly different nuances. Matthew and Mark were alive during the time of Jesus, adults. Luke was likely a kid, and it shows up in the gospel in one of the crowds at some point. And then the Gospel of John is written 100 years after Jesus is dead. And there isn't a John. There's an Apostle John, but it's written by, in this time, it's very normal for a school of writers to write in the name of someone to get notoriety or authority from that. So it's a bunch of different men writing in the name of John 100 years after Jesus is dead, who don't know him at all. And that's where you get the mystical or mythical Christ figure that proliferates. But until that point, it's a Jewish movement that breaks off with Pauline teachings, and then really goes in another direction 100 years later with Johannine, John, the school of John.